What would you do if the only thing left of the person you loved most was a key to a forgotten place, a deed to a hole in the ground that everyone in the world called worthless? For 21-year-old Grace Harlan, that wasn't a question. It was the sum of her inheritance. She was given the deed to the Garnet Queen Mine, a silver claim abandoned for 90 years, a place whose only legacy was failure. But the truth waiting at the bottom of its silent, dark shaft was a secret the mountain had kept for nearly a century, a final message left behind by men who never came back. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we follow one young woman's lonely journey into the heart of a legend. Grace Harlan arrived back in the town of Garnet Springs on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of faded denim. The dust from the road coated her grandfather's old pickup, a fine red powder that settled into the cracked vinyl of the dashboard and the creases of her worn leather gloves. She was 21, but her eyes held the quiet, steady weight of someone much older, a stillness learned from watching a long illness take its course. Her grandfather, Thomas Harlan, had been the last of his kind, a man who spoke of geology like poetry and believed in the whispers of the earth. He had died 2 weeks prior, leaving her with the truck, a few $100s, and a folded, brittle deed in a manila envelope. The Garnet Queen, his folly, his faith, now hers. The town hadn't changed. It was a single street of false front buildings leaning against each other for support, their paint peeling under the relentless Montana sun. Faces turned as she drove past the general store, heads tilting in recognition. They remembered her as Tom Harlan's quiet granddaughter, the girl who spent her summers listening to his stories instead of running with the other children. Now they saw the same quiet girl, but the man who had been her anchor was gone. Their looks were a mixture of pity and a kind of weary judgment. They knew why she was here. They knew about the deed. To them, it wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden, the final chapter of an old man's foolish dream. She parked in front of the boarding house, the only one in town, and the engine's grumble died into a profound silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines on the ridge. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Her grandfather's hand, calloused and warm, covering hers. "The earth don't forget, Gracie," he'd rasped, his voice thin as smoke. "It just waits." The words had been his final gift, a compass pointing toward this forgotten corner of the world. She took a slow breath, the air tasting of dust and sage. She was alone, with nothing but a dead man's faith and a key to a locked piece of ground. She had come not to dig for silver, but to find the shape of the hole he had left in her life. The weight of that task felt heavier than any mountain. The morning was cool and sharp, the kind that promised a hot afternoon. Grace walked to the county clerk's office, the manila envelope held tight in her hand. The building was made of the same tired wood as the rest of the town, but the brass handle on the door was polished bright. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. A thin man with a green visor, Mr. Abernathy, peered at her over his spectacles. He remembered her, of course. He'd known her grandfather for 50 years. "Grace," he said, his voice soft with practiced sympathy. "Come about the claim, I suppose." She nodded, sliding the envelope across the polished counter. He opened it, his fingers gentle on the brittle paper, and began the slow, methodical process of transferring the title. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room until the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and the heavy tread of expensive boots. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway. He was a man who seemed to take up more space than he was due, with a thick neck that strained against the collar of his clean shirt, and a voice that was always a little too loud. He was a developer from Bozeman, buying up old claims for their timber rights and mineral leases, promising progress that looked a lot like demolition. He saw Grace, then the deed on the counter, and a slow, contemptuous smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," Blackwood boomed, striding forward. "Little Grace Harlan, come to collect your inheritance?" He leaned against the counter, his presence crowding her. "Sorry about your granddad, girl. He was a dreamer. A fool, but a dreamer." Grace didn't answer. She stared at the ink drying on the new ledger page, her name written in Abernathy's careful script. "I'll make you the same offer I made him," Blackwood continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble. $500 for the whole worthless plot. It'll save you the trouble of paying taxes on a tombstone." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "That mine is a death trap. The headframe's rotten, the shaft's flooded, and the elevator, hell. That thing's just a prayer hanging on a piece of rust." He chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Take the money. Buy a bus ticket somewhere warm. There's nothing for you here." The dismissed object of his scorn, the Garnet Queen, was more than just land to Grace. It was the physical manifestation of her grandfather's soul. It was the stories he'd told her of Cornish miners and the scent of blasting powder, of the clang of hammer on steel echoing in the dark. It was his belief that the men who'd worked that mine hadn't just left. They'd left something behind. Something important. "No thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She took the newly stamped deed from Mr. Abernathy, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. Blackwood's smile vanished. "Suit yourself," he sneered. "Don't come crying to me when you fall down that hole and break your neck." He turned and stomped out, leaving the scent of cigar smoke and condescension in his wake. Was Grace simply clinging to a dead man's fantasy? Or did she sense a truth that everyone else had forgotten? What secret could possibly be worth risking everything for, hidden in a place the world had already condemned? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as Grace walked out into the harsh sunlight, she felt not fear, but a strange and steady calm. The mockery had not weakened her resolve. It had forged it into steel. Grace spent the rest of the day at the general store, buying supplies. Rope, kerosene for her grandfather's old lantern, canned beans, coffee, and a new whetstone for his axe. The woman behind the counter, Alma, was nearly as old as the town itself. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and her eyes, pale and sharp, seemed to see more than most. She watched Grace pile her goods on the counter, her gaze lingering on the heavy-duty rope. "Headed up to the Queen, are you?" Alma asked, her voice dry as autumn leaves. Grace nodded. Alma rang up the items with a slow, deliberate hand. As she packed them into a burlap sack, she paused. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, not looking at Grace. "Listened more than he talked. Most men are the other way around." She finished packing the bag and pushed it across the counter. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Grace's for the first time. "He used to say that mountain don't give up its dead," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "But it keeps its promises." The words were strange, cryptic, and they settled in Grace's mind like a smooth, heavy stone. She didn't understand them, but she knew they were important. She paid for her things and left, the weight of the old woman's words following her out into the street. The townspeople watched her load the truck. Their whispers were a chorus of doubt. Just like her granddad, a man sharpening a knife on the saloon porch muttered to his friend, "Got the same stubborn sickness." Another, leaning against a post, shook his head. "She's just a girl. That place ain't safe." Their words were meant to be overheard, a wall of caution and pity meant to turn her back. But to Grace, they were just noise, like the wind in the wires overhead. She had spent a lifetime listening to one man's voice, and it was the only one that mattered now. Silas Blackwood drove by in his shiny new automobile, slowing down just enough to give her a look of theatrical pity, a shake of his head that said, "I tried to warn you." He saw her not as a person, but as a foolish obstacle, a sentimental girl standing in the way of his profit. His dismissal was a tangible thing, an insult that solidified her purpose. She was no longer just honoring a memory. She was defending it. She finished loading the last of her gear, securing the canvas tarp with practiced knots. Her grandfather's silent companion, his old brass carbide lamp, sat on the passenger seat, its metal cool and solid beneath her hand. It hadn't held a flame in years, but for her, it held a presence. It was a piece of him she could carry with her into the dark. The final person she saw was Jed Stone, her grandfather's oldest friend. He pulled up beside her in his own battered truck, his face etched with concern. He didn't offer warnings or judgment. He just handed her a heavy, grease-stained canvas roll. "Your granddad's tools," Jed said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotion. "Figured you might need 'em." He didn't stay to talk. He just nodded once and drove away. The simple act of kindness, of faith, was enough. As the sun began to dip behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, Grace drove out of town, leaving the chorus of whispers behind her. The road to the Garnet Queen was waiting. The road up the mountain was less a road than a memory. It was a pair of ruts carved into the earth a century ago, now overgrown with sagebrush and choked with rockfall. Grace's truck bucked and groaned, its engine laboring as she navigated the steep inclines in low gear. The valley floor fell away below, the town shrinking to a child's collection of wooden blocks. After an hour, the trees grew thicker, lodgepole pine and aspen, their leaves trembling in the breeze. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Finally, the road ended in a small, flat clearing. And there it was. The head frame of the Garnet Queen stood stark against the sky, a skeletal silhouette of massive timbers, weathered to a silver gray. It was bigger than she'd imagined, a monument to forgotten industry. It listed slightly to one side, like an old man leaning on a cane, but it was still standing. Below it, the mine entrance was a dark maw, covered by a heavy, rusted iron grate padlocked shut. Grace killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It was a silence made of stone and time. She got out of the truck, her boots crunching on the gravel. She walked to the edge of the shaft, her grandfather's heavy iron key clutched in her hand. The grate was cold and solid. She peered through the bars into the darkness below. A cool, mineral breath rose from the depths, carrying the scent of cold rock and still water. She saw the freight elevator. It hung about 20 feet down, suspended by a thick, rust-caked cable that snaked up to a massive winding drum in the hoist house next to the headframe. It was just a platform, a simple cage of iron straps and a wooden floor, big enough for a few men and an ore cart. It was exactly as Blackwood had described it, a prayer hanging on a piece of rust. For a long moment, Disappointment felt like a physical weight in her chest. It looked impossible, a death trap. The townspeople were right. Her grandfather had been a dreamer. She spent the rest of the afternoon making camp, setting up a small canvas tent near a stand of pines, building a fire ring from creek stones. She worked with a slow, methodical rhythm, the familiar motions calming her thoughts. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, she sat by her small fire, the deed resting on her knee. The mountain was quiet, watchful. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being the only person for miles, perhaps the only person who had stood on this spot in decades. That night, she slept in her grandfather's old bedroll, the scent of canvas and wood smoke familiar and comforting. The wind whispered through the pines, a sound like a distant ocean. She dreamed of the mine, of the darkness below. But it wasn't a frightening darkness. It was a quiet, waiting dark. She woke just before dawn, the air cold and sharp. The first rays of sun were just touching the top of the headframe, making the old wood glow. She felt a shift inside her, a hardening of the doubt that had plagued her. It didn't matter if it was impossible. It only mattered that she try. She had not come this far to be scared off by rust and shadows. The key her grandfather had left her fit the old padlock on the grate. It turned with a screech of protesting metal, the sound shockingly loud in the morning stillness. With Jed's help, he'd driven up that morning, unasked. With a thermos of coffee and a grim set to his jaw, she managed to heave the heavy iron grate open. It swung back on stiff hinges, revealing the dark, square opening of the shaft. The air that rose up was colder now, ancient and undisturbed. Jed peered down, shaking his head. 90 years, Gracie. That cable's seen 90 winters. Grace didn't look at the cable. She looked at the winding house, the small, sturdy building that contained the heart of the operation. The door was swollen shut, but the old axe from her grandfather's tool roll made short work of it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and decay. A layer of dust and pine needles covered everything. The massive winding drum dominated the space, its steel cable, thick as her wrist, wrapped neatly around it. The brake lever, a huge iron handle, was locked in place. Everything was coated in a thick layer of grime and rust. But as she ran her hand along the brake mechanism, her fingers came away with something else. A thick, black, viscous grease. It was old, but it hadn't completely hardened. Someone had packed the moving parts, protecting them from the slow seizure of time. This was the first clue. It was a small detail, but it refused to fit the narrative of abandonment and decay. You don't grease a machine you intend to leave forever. Grease is for maintenance. It's an act of faith in a future use. She pointed it out to Jed, who grunted, his skepticism warring with his trust in her grandfather's bloodline. Could be, he allowed. Or maybe they just didn't have time to wipe it down before they locked the doors. But Grace knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was intentional. Her grandfather had always said, "Look at the work, not the story." The story was that the mine failed and the miners walked away, but the work told a different tale. While Jed inspected the timbers of the headframe, tapping them with a hammer and listening to the sound, Grace turned her attention to the cable anchor. It was a massive iron plate bolted into the bedrock beside the winding house. The bolts were thick as her arm, their hexagonal heads flaked with rust. All except one. Near the bottom, half hidden by overgrown weeds, was a single bolt that was different. The metal was darker, less pitted. The edges of the hex head were sharper, less worn. It was newer. Not new, but newer than the others. It had been replaced, and not 70 years ago, but more recently. Maybe 20 years ago. Maybe 30. Around the time her grandfather had first started spending his summers up here, telling her he was just prospecting. He had been here. He had been working. He hadn't just been dreaming. He had been preparing. The knowledge sent a jolt through her, a current of connection to the man she had lost. He had known something. He had seen something. And he had been laying the groundwork, one bolt at a time, for this very moment. The mountain held its promises, and her grandfather had made one of his own. For the next week, Grace and Jed worked from sunup to sundown. It was a slow, punishing education in forgotten mechanics. They started with the cable, using a heavy block and tackle rigged to the strongest timber of the headframe. They took the tension off the line. Jed, a retired mechanic, showed Grace how to inspect it, inch by painstaking inch. They scraped away the rust, revealing the tightly wound steel beneath. It was pitted in places, frayed in others. But the core, Jed declared, after cutting a small section from the end, was sound. They made things to last back then, he grumbled, though a new note of respect had entered his voice. They spent 2 days cleaning the winding drum and the massive gear system, using wire brushes and rags soaked in kerosene. Underneath the grime, the steel was dark and strong. They packed the gears with fresh grease, the new lubricant a clean amber color against the old black preservation grease. The brake was the biggest challenge. It was seized tight. They worked on it for a full day, using penetrating oil and the long, persuasive leverage of a steel pipe, before it finally broke free with a deafening groan. Grace felt the vibration through the soles of her boots, a shudder that seemed to come from the deep earth. It was the mountain stirring from its long sleep. Her silent companion through it all was the brass carbide lamp. Each evening, after Jed had driven back down the mountain, she would sit by her fire and clean it. She dismantled it, polished the brass reflectors until they shone, and cleared the jets with a fine piece of wire. It was a ritual, a way of connecting with the patience and care her grandfather had embodied. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher, stained with grease and rust. She felt herself changing, the soft edges of her grief being ground away by the hard, physical reality of the work. She was learning the language of the machine, the logic of lever and gear and counterweight. Her hands were learning the thing her mind had not yet fully understood. This was not a resurrection. It was a continuation. One afternoon, while tightening the bolts on the elevator cage itself, her wrench slipped. It clattered on the wooden floor and fell through a crack. Cursing softly, she knelt and peered into the darkness. There, wedged between two of the main floor planks, was a small, flat piece of metal. It was a tin tobacco box, rusted nearly shut. She worked it free and took it over to the light. It took her 10 minutes to pry the lid open with the edge of a screwdriver. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry, crumbling tobacco, was not a photograph or a coin, but a single folded piece of oilcloth. She carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of the mine's lower level. It showed the main drift, the crosscuts, the stopes. But on the eastern side, there was a section marked with a heavy X and a single, neatly printed word, keepsake. The map was dated October 28, 1929, the day before the stock market crash that would plunge the country into the Great Depression, the day the world changed, the day the miners of the Garnet Queen must have realized they might not be coming back. The day finally came when there was nothing left to do but try. Jed had rigged a small, cantankerous gasoline engine to the winding drum's main gear, a temporary heart for the iron beast. It coughed to life with a plume of blue smoke. Its steady put a nervous rhythm against the mountain's silence. "This is it, Gracie," Jed said, his hand on the brake lever. "You don't have to do this." But she did. She clipped her grandfather's lamp to her belt, now filled with fresh carbide and water, ready to light. She put on a hard hat Jed had brought for her and checked the coils of rope and the pack on her back. She stepped onto the elevator platform. The old wood creaked, but held her weight. She gripped the iron cage, her knuckles white. "Okay, Jed," she said, her voice steady. "Easy." With a screech of metal on metal, the brake released. The platform lurched, then began its slow, deliberate descent into the darkness. The square of blue sky above her shrank. The rock walls of the shaft slid past, damp and glistening. The air grew cold, smelling of stone and secrets. The light from above faded, and she was enveloped in a profound, absolute blackness. She reached for her lamp, her fingers finding the striker. A flick of her thumb, a shower of sparks, and a soft hiss as the acetylene caught. A bright, clean flame bloomed, pushing back the dark. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. She saw the strata of the rock, veins of quartz like white scars. She saw old timbers, wedged in place as supports, slick with moisture. The descent was slow, maybe 50 feet a minute. She counted the seconds, tracking her depth. 200 feet, 300. The engine's noise was a faint murmur from the world above. Down here, the only sounds were the drip of water and the steady creak of the cable. At 500 feet, the elevator shuddered to a stop. Jed had marked the cable. This was it, the main level. Her light played across the opening of a tunnel, its floor laid with rusted, narrow-gauge rails. It was just as the map had shown. She unclipped a safety rope and secured it to the cage, then to her harness. She swung her pack onto her back and stepped out of the elevator and into the mine. The air was perfectly still, the silence so complete it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. She was standing in a place that hadn't felt a human footstep in 90 years. She pulled the oilcloth map from her pocket. Following its lines, she walked east, her boots crunching on the gravelly floor. The main tunnel was wide and high, a testament to the labor that had carved it from solid rock. After 100 yards, she came to a crosscut, and there, just as the map had promised, she saw it. It wasn't a cave-in. It wasn't a wall of rubble. It was a wall of carefully laid bricks and mortar, sealing the tunnel from floor to ceiling. It was perfect, professional, and utterly out of place. This was no emergency measure. This was a vault. In the center of the wall, at eye level, was a single loose brick. Her heart pounded in her chest. With trembling fingers, she worked the brick free. It came away smoothly, as if it had been waiting. She raised her lamp to the dark opening. The beam cut through the blackness and fell upon a world frozen in time. A sudden, violent tremor shook the ground. Dust rained down from the ceiling of the tunnel, and a deep, groaning sound echoed from the direction of the shaft. Grace stumbled back from the wall, her heart seizing with primal fear. The ground shuddered again, more violently this time, and the carbide lamp flickered, its steady flame faltering. She heard a sickening sound from above, the sharp crack of stressed timber followed by the percussive roar of falling rock. The main shaft, a collapse. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was 500 feet underground, cut off from the only way out. Her first instinct was to run, to scramble back to the elevator, but she forced it down. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Panic is a thief. It steals your breath and your sense. She took a slow, ragged breath, then another, forcing the air into her tight lungs. The lamp flame steadied. The rumbling subsided, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. She had to choose. Stay here, in the relative stability of the crosscut, or risk heading back toward the shaft to see the extent of the damage. The choice was a test of everything she had learned, of every bit of resolve she had forged in the long days of labor. She had to know. She made her way back down the main drift, her light beam dancing nervously ahead. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Small rocks and debris littered the tracks. As she rounded the final bend, she saw it. The entrance to the shaft was choked with a massive pile of rock and splintered timbers. A section of the shaft wall near the top must have given way, triggered by the vibrations of the engine. The elevator cage was gone, either crushed or fallen to the bottom of the shaft. She was trapped. A wave of despair washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. This was it. This was the end Blackwood had predicted, the tombstone he'd mocked. She leaned against the cold rock wall, the beam of her lamp illuminating the impenetrable wall of rubble. For a moment she let the hopelessness consume her, but then another sound reached her. A faint cry. "Hello? Is anyone down there?" The voice was thin, panicked, and it came from the other side of the rockfall. It was Jed. He was alive. "Jed!" she yelled, her voice cracking. "Jed, I'm here! I'm okay!" Relief, sharp and painful, brought tears to her eyes. "Thank God," his voice came back, muffled. "The north wall gave way. Are you hurt?" "No, just trapped." There was a long pause. "All right, Gracie," he called, his voice steadier now, taking charge. "Don't you worry. I'm going for help. You just stay put and stay warm." The thought of waiting, of doing nothing, was unbearable, but she had to trust him. She retreated to the bricked-up drift, the safest place in the mine. She had matches, a half-full canteen, and 2 bars of chocolate. She could last for a while. As she settled down to wait, another tremor, much smaller this time, shook the ground. It came not from the shaft, but from deeper in the mountain. It was then she noticed it, a faint, steady draft coming from the hole in the brick wall. Air. There was airflow. This tunnel, this sealed-off drift, had another way out. The news of the collapse and Grace's predicament spread through Garnet Springs like a wildfire. Jed, his face pale with dust and fear, had driven his truck into town with the horn blaring, skidding to a stop in front of the saloon. Within an hour, a rescue was being organized. Men who had mocked Grace's endeavor now grabbed shovels and ropes, their faces grim with a shared sense of responsibility. Silas Blackwood, hearing the commotion from the clerk's office, came out onto the porch. He watched the flurry of activity, a complex expression on his face. He saw the genuine fear and determination in the eyes of the townspeople, and for the first time, his cynical certainty seemed to waver. The rescue effort was slow and dangerous. The shaft was unstable, and more rock could come down at any moment. They worked for hours, clearing the rubble by the bucketful, shoring up the damaged timbers. Down below, Grace followed the draft. With her rock hammer, she carefully widened the hole in the brick wall until she could squeeze through. The air on the other side was cool and fresh. The space was not a tunnel, but a large, dry cavern, and it was not empty. In the steady glow of her lamp, she saw what the miners had left behind. Stacked neatly against the far wall were wooden chests, their brass corners gleaming. Alongside them stood canvas sacks cinched tight at the top. Mining tools, drills, hammers, picks were laid out on an oilcloth, cleaned and oiled, as if ready for the next day's shift. On a small, makeshift table made from a crate, an open ledger lay next to a tin box. This was the keepsake. It wasn't a secret vein of silver. It was everything they owned. She opened the ledger. On the first page, in elegant cursive, it read, Garnet Queen Miners Cooperative. Final accounting, October 28, 1929. Inside were names, dozens of them, and next to each name, a share number. This was their wealth, their life savings, pooled together. She opened one of the canvas sacks. It was filled not with ore, but with personal effects. A tarnished silver locket, a worn leather-bound Bible, a child's small wooden horse, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. This was their history. She opened one of the chests. It was filled with breathtakingly high-grade silver ore, samples so rich they looked more metal than rock. Their final dividend, set aside and waiting for their return. Following the draft, she found a narrow fissure at the back of the cavern, a natural vent that snaked its way up through the mountain. It was a tight squeeze, but it was a way out. As she began her slow, arduous climb, the men above finally broke through the last of the rockfall. They found the empty tunnel and the hole in the brick wall. When Grace emerged hours later, scratched and exhausted, into the late afternoon sun from an old prospecting adit a half-mile down the mountain, the entire town was there. A cheer went up. Jed wrapped her in a fierce hug, his relief too great for words. A doctor from a neighboring town checked her over, pronouncing her perfectly fine. He was the kind professional, calm and competent, and his presence lent an official gravity to the events. It was he who, after hearing her story, went down into the mine with a geologist who had joined the rescue party. They emerged an hour later, their faces filled with awe. "It's a time capsule," the geologist told the assembled crowd. "Perfectly preserved. It's a find of incredible historical significance." The townspeople looked at Grace with new eyes. She was not the foolish girl who had chased a ghost. She was the keeper of their town's soul. Silas Blackwood stood at the back of the crowd, silent. He looked at the mountain, then at Grace, and for the first time, he saw not a worthless plot of land, but a place of deep and profound value that could never be measured in dollars. He had been humbled, not by force, but by a simple, undeniable truth he had been blind to. In the weeks that followed, the Garnet Queen became a different kind of treasure. Historians and museum curators came, carefully cataloging the contents of the sealed cavern. The names in the ledger were cross-referenced, and descendants of the original miners were found all across the country. Small canvas bags containing a share of the silver ore and the personal effects of a long-lost grandfather or great-uncle began to arrive at doorsteps, closing a circle 90 years in the making. The town of Garnet Springs came alive. The story was in newspapers statewide. Tourists began to arrive, not to see a working mine, but to stand at the edge of the shaft and feel the weight of the history Grace had uncovered. The townspeople who had once whispered in judgment now spoke her name with a quiet reverence. They were the stewards of the story, and she was the one who had brought it back to them. Grace worked alongside the historians, her knowledge of her grandfather's stories providing context that no document could. She learned the names of the men who had worked the rock, their hopes and their fears recorded in the letters they'd left behind. She felt a kinship with them, a sense of belonging that ran deeper than blood. One evening, at golden hour, she stood at the entrance to the mine. The setting sun bathed the headframe in a warm, amber light, making the old wood look noble and strong. The air was cool and smelled of pine. The silence had returned, but it was no longer a lonely silence. It was peaceful, filled with the presence of the past. Jed stood beside her, the two of them watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the jagged peaks. He had been her rock, her steadfast believer when she had none but herself. "Your granddad would be proud, Gracie," he said softly. "Prouder than words can say." Grace looked from the mine to the town twinkling in the valley below, then back to the solid, sleeping mountain. She had come here seeking a connection to the man she had lost, a way to make sense of his legacy. She had found something far greater. She had found the purpose behind his faith. She thought of the tools laid out neatly in the dark, the letters waiting to be read, the small treasures saved for a future that never came. She understood now what he had been searching for, what he had been working toward with his quiet, patient labor. He hadn't been chasing a lost fortune. He had been trying to finish a story. In the quiet of the twilight, she finally gave voice to the truth she had unearthed, a truth more precious than any silver. He wasn't chasing a treasure, she said, her voice clear and sure in the still air. He was saving a memory. Thank you for staying with us for this story to the very end. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest value is often found in honoring the stories that came before us. If you were moved by Grace's journey, please give this video a like and share in the comments what you believe is the most valuable thing we can inherit. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of discovery and redemption. We'll see you next time.